At the Battle of Loredo, in the invasion prong of Group Armies 7 through 13, moving through the area, it was now going into hour number 4, with the forces having since already crossed the border, with the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry primarily tasked with seizing and clearing the whole city and metro area, essentially, of Loredo, of all armed resistance of any type, thereby safely clearing I-35 for the use of all the group armies of the roughly 370,000 soldier strong entire force to be able to move up I-35 in a convoy formation upon the cessation of hostilities within this zone. Also, by hour number 4, the 165th Armored Brigade, already having since moved through the city and to the south before heading east, had already crushed the 536th Brigade Support Battalion and a cluster of roughly 200 armed civilians just to their south, with heavy artillery support from the 43rd Artillery Brigade in terms of howitzer fire from their 2 battalions each of 152 and 155 millimeter howitzers, consisting of PLL-01 155 millimeter towed howitzers and PLL-66 towed 152 millimeter howitzers, as well as rockets of the 122 millimeter caliber fired by their multiple launch rocket systems, their PHL-81 systems. As this had been wrapped up, the 165th Armored Brigade then swung to the north, slightly northeast, surrounded and destroyed yet another small pocket of civilian resistance, by which time, as intelligence reports were coming in on one of the final remaining National Guard battalions, the 1st Squadron of the 112th Cavalry Regiment, a part of the 72nd Infantry Brigade combat team, the forces were advised to prepare to move on the now moving battalion of Americans, or squadron rather, as this was a cavalry unit and they called their battalions squadrons, as the squadron of Americans had originally came to the area and was thus dropped off by HETs, or heavy equipment transportation trucks, along with all their equipment, supplies, and troops, which were bussed in and dropped off at this bivouac area where they temporarily camped out a day prior before the invasion even began. And their original mission plan of this squadron of cavalry forces called for their whole battalion to move to reinforce the 172nd Brigade Engineering Battalion, which itself by this point in the battle, before even 4 hours in, within only the first 2 hours, had been destroyed by heavy artillery fire from the 43rd Artillery Brigade, as well as artillery fire coming from the 17th Infantry Division's own battalion of artillery, their self-propelled PLZ-05 howitzers, which were 155 millimeter howitzers. Small, tiny elements of the now smashed 172nd tried to flee the battle space, although they aimlessly tried to swing to the south, only to be intercepted by certain battalions peeling off of the original crescent forces of all the arrayed battalions of the 17th Infantry Division's combat battalions and intercepted and destroyed these retreating forces as they tried to head south. Originally, the 17th Infantry Division had split up into two different groupings of its subordinate battalions that comprised it, with one grouping of battalions crossing State Highway 83 after crossing the border at the Rio Grande River as they destroyed the 172nd Brigade Engineering Battalion within its chain of FOBs/combat outposts, with the other portion of their division's battalions crossing further south at the border before also likewise crossing State Highway 83 to head further inland to the east, where they surrounded a grouping of armed civilians which was spotted by a circling CH-4A armed reconnaissance drone, which likewise even helped out in the combat in this situation by firing some of its air-to-ground munitions, being HJ-10 anti-tank missiles, which it carried 6 missiles aboard, as it had the option to carry 6 different types of ordnance for air-to-ground purposes. The 17th ID was to reform itself by the two different prongs of it linking back up before moving north, as their commander too was given orders to prepare to intercept the now moving 1st of the 112th Cavalry Squadron of the Americans, as the Americans continued to conduct their originally planned objective of linking up with the now destroyed, unbeknownst to them, 172nd Brigade Engineering Battalion, even as their communications were completely gone due to the anti-satellite and cyber attacks, as well as the electronic warfare jamming conducted by the 10th Group Army's 10th Signals Regiment, also responsible for electronic warfare. So they too began to conduct a caterpillar-like slow roll in a rolling H formation as they moved down through farm roads and into a valley, which would become a valley of death for them and their entire formation. As soon as forward units, battalions belonging to the 165th Armored Brigade, having just finished off this pocket of civilians, was to begin to intercept and herd them into a pre-selected kill box in order for massive artillery strikes to begin to rain upon them, as well as battalions from the 17th Infantry Division creating a blocking maneuver coming up from the south after they themselves had surrounded and destroyed another civilian pocket of armed reactionary civilians with the aid of their own artillery battalion having fired upon them. All of this, of course, occurring by the beginning of the 4th hour, leaving off here with the 165th conducting this destruction of these armed reactionary civilians, and the 17th conducting this destruction of these armed reactionary civilians after they'd reformed their whole division upon the two separate prongs having come together after clearing the southern flank of the entire battle space, or AO, that they were responsible for before heading north. Even as the 1st of the 112th Cavalry was beginning to move south, they began to be hit by long-range artillery shells, namely Chinese 155mm WS-35R munitions, which were satellite-guided, rocket-assisted projectiles, which gave them a much longer range than standard HE 155mm shells, with their total range being a maximum of 37 miles. Not quite as long as the 300mm rocket artillery, which There was also a battalion within the artillery brigade of the 43rd Artillery Brigade, but it was definitely equal to the longer range rockets possessed by the PHL-81 MLRS system, which was essentially a Chinese Grad for all intents and purposes. But that system could carry newer, longer range rockets that put it almost on par with the rocket-assisted projectiles able to be fired by the 155 millimeter howitzers in the Chinese arsenal. Upon having sufficiently secured I-35 within Loredo by hour number 4, the stream of vast units within the 7 large different group armies of this invasion prong could now begin to cross the border in earnest behind the advancing 10th Group Army, which was leading this group of group armies constituting 7 different group armies as a whole. As the 17th Group Army began to clear the southern flanks of the AO as a whole, initially having crushed the border forces of the paramilitary agencies at the border of approximately 340-odd agents, lightly armed and equipped, before moving on to encircling and crushing pockets of armed civilians in the countryside, as shown earlier. These encounters were quickly solved via methods of extreme prejudice en route to the now moving, albeit slowly, 1st of the 112th Cav, a squadron in cavalry terms, which is a battalion-sized unit. Orders came in to the 17th ID's commander from the 10th Group Army's commander to intercept and help destroy the 1st of the 112th Cavalry Regiment, as this armored unit could be a potential thorn in the side of the crossing forces currently invading within this sector alone. Sent to carry out the operation was the 17th ID's 1 armored battalion, as well as 2 of the 10 of the division's mechanized infantry battalions. Satellites and drones monitoring the American unit spotted it having had left its bivouac location, or in other words, its temporary campsite, upon recently being unloaded by HETs, or heavy equipment transporter trucks, merely hours before the invasion started. As they moved in order to originally reinforce the already crushed 172nd Brigade Engineering Battalion, as per their original mission plan, they therefore were completely unaware of its fate as of this moment, as this battalion, like all the others, or this squadron, a battalion-sized unit, had lost its comms, like all the other American forces on the map. Although the 1st of the 112th did choose to stick to its original mission plan, as the division had split into different axes of advance pertaining to the 17th, they were to link up upon the destruction of the 1st of the 112th Cavalry Regiment, thereby clearing the flanks and securing the south of the Loredo AO completely upon having carried out this mission. Unaware of the encroaching peril, the Americans moved into an H formation as it pertained to their vehicles, with heavier companies on the outside protecting the headquarters company inside, which contained the command elements of the squadron and was more lightly equipped in terms of its vehicles. 17th ID's armored battalions, tank and mechanized infantry companies, or armored infantry companies, encircled the slinkying American battalion along with armored companies from the 165th Armored Brigade's one armored battalion sent into the area out of its multiple armored battalions. It was sighted moving down a Texas farm road as it pertained to the 1st of the 112th, as common country routes were named within the state of Texas. Mechanized infantry companies of the 2 mechanized infantry battalions assigned to the battle came up from the south, trapping the Americans into a 2x2 mile kill box. As tank shells, 125 millimeter tank shells, flew from Chinese Type 96B main battle tanks over 3 miles away at the limits of their range, several American vehicles were instantly destroyed, along with HJ-10 anti-tank missiles likewise being lobbed from AFT-10 anti-tank vehicles of the Armored Battalion's own anti-tank company. There was a pursuing tank company which belonged to the 165th Armored Brigade's battalion assigned to the area, while the others had set up on high ground above a valley for optimal sighting and to avoid friendly fire due to such a tight encirclement of the American unit, with Chinese systems employed all having fairly long-range weaponry, from the 125 millimeter main guns of the Type 96B main battle tanks to the 100 millimeter cannons and 30 millimeter autocannons of the infantry fighting vehicles, being the ZBD-04s, and finally the HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, also on board of the ZBD-04A types, or ZBD-04As, as well as the HJ-10s, being anti-tank missiles on the AFT-10s, which were dedicated anti-tank vehicles, which boasted a 6.2 mile maximum range. CH-901s, armed with heat warheads, or high explosive anti-tank warheads, fired by the headquarters battalion of the 17th Infantry Division, mission specific for eliminating American tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, as well as the lighter vehicles like armor personnel carriers or even MRAPs. Also, in addition, even an airstrike was added to the devastation, as one of the 12 J-16s from the J-16 squadron, now on its 3rd sortie, carrying ample ground attack munitions in the form of 4 1,000-pound laser-guided ordnance, dropped as a payload upon the lead vehicles of the American forces. Along with all of the aforementioned, with the 17th ID's Infantry Division's own artillery battalion firing its 155 millimeter shells from its own artillery battalion, operating PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzer batteries, respectively. This artillery battalion, belonging to the 17th ID, had several batteries of 155 millimeter PLZ-05 howitzers. All of the various weapons employed totally lit up the 2-by-2-mile valley area that the battalion, or rather squadron, of Americans became trapped within. Only a handful of American vehicles peeled off of their respective companies in a feeble attempt of trying to maneuver against the enemy, only to find they themselves were totally trapped and quickly destroyed as a result. Due to no communications and the confusion erupting, the H formation began to try to desperately proceed out of the valley, only to have munitions literally rain down upon them in the form of artillery shells and airdropped 1,000-pound ordnance. After only 30 minutes of being chased into the kill box and 15 more minutes of a savage barrage, the 1st of the 112th ceased to exist on the map, both literally and figuratively. On the map, as satellites and drones spotted the 1st of the 112th, originally trying to move according to its original mission plan as stated to reinforce the now destroyed 172nd Brigade Engineering Battalion, which they were unaware of as there were no communications or way to know that. The commander made the executive decision to proceed along the prescribed route, only to have artillery fired upon leaving the bivouac area from the Chi-Com 43rd Artillery Brigade. Both rocket artillery as well as rocket-assisted howitzer ammunition, which consisted of essentially a rocket motor that ignited once the artillery shell was fired, which propelled the shell many more miles than an ordinary HE shell could travel, even with maximum powder charges in the howitzer. A typical HE shell of the 155 variety only being able to travel between 18 and 20 miles, whereas a rocket-assisted projectile such as this WS-35R could travel many more miles, 37 as a maximum. And along with 122 millimeter rockets of a longer range variety were certainly able to hit the 1st of the 112th's bivouac deep inland, along with the 300 millimeter rockets of that specific battalion of PHL-03, heavy 300 millimeter rockets belonging to the 43rd as well. As all of this came in and these forces were trying to stick to their original mission plan, they, instead of in a line formation, they grouped together in a rolling H, protecting their weakest company, being the headquarters company, as their vehicles consisted of a fuel truck, a M88 recovery vehicle, some Max Pro MRAPs as security vehicles and command vehicles, and light trucks like LMTV trucks for supplies, logistics, for the medics, and so on and so forth, and for the administrative forces. As the outer forces trying to guard the headquarters company consisted of the 2 armored or tank companies of the squadron, here and here, as well as the 2 rifle companies, which essentially were just 2 mechanized infantry companies belonging to the squadron, which, in concert with their armored forces, provided the armor infantry support as the armor provided support for the infantry and vice versa. So there were 5 American companies that comprised this battalion, and above the area, a stealth WZ-8 drone was flying many thousands of feet over the area, circling the battlefield, constantly relaying footage and data back to combat data links, as well as to the central AI system, which processed all the combat data and map data and just all data types combined in general, as in order to be processed and relayed through the analysts back to the command, making command decisions faster than ever before, as this AI system processed information extremely fast, making battles, fluid battles at that, much easier to decipher insofar as where the enemies were headed, what they had as weapons, what their capabilities were, and where to send forces in order to ambush them, especially now that the enemy had no more communications or reconnaissance capabilities or intelligence gathering capabilities of their own, aside from very localized forces acting as reconnaissance elements on the ground. There's a lot going on in this map of this battle. Instead of a segment of the battle, this is actually a whole battle in this map, because the force that's being ambushed, this squadron, this first of the 112 Cav, is completely surrounded, beset on all sides by Chi-Com forces belonging to the 165th Armored Brigade, one of its subordinate battalions tasked out to the area, and not even the whole battalion, but just one of the 4 tank companies of one battalion, closed the circle and began to pursue them. This started another mile away, another mile back, as these forces were further back and moving. At the end of the valley, where the road goes to a T intersection, you have forces of the 17th Infantry Division. They're one tank battalion contributing a few different tank companies, as well as their armored infantry company, 2 of which actually, one here, and then you have a mechanized infantry company coming up here. At this farmhouse, up this driveway here, this farmhouse, you have forward dismounted elements of these mechanized infantry forces who set up an OP, or an observation point, to monitor the slow-moving, approaching American forces, sending up their squad's reconnaissance drones, their quadcopter recon drones, their small ones, to survey the area and relay exact coordinates for the artillery to send back to not just the combat data links, but to the FDCs who were in each artillery battery who gave the fire missions. They calculated the fire missions and passed them down to the guns, so the guns could fire extremely accurately. All of these are where shells were starting to land beyond the point of the very initial showing of the map, where these blasts are already happening upon just showing the map. These shells flew in here, and there in rapid succession, as these forces moving this way, trying to take this side of the road, and these trying to take this side of the road, and these guys going straight, unsure which way to go, whether to go with the infantry prong or whether to go with the armor. By then it was too late, as the shells began to land and seriously cripple many vehicles, if not outright destroy them, along with a J-16 flying high above, dropping laser-guided 1,000-pound munitions on the front vehicles, or the point vehicles, of the convoy. These forces that set up this OP at this farm, behind this barn and behind this house, they were starting to take some fire, even as this artillery was beginning to splash in the area, as they call it. Tanks that hadn't quite yet been destroyed as of that second began to fire their coax machine guns at these buildings, along with shells, towards these infantry fighting vehicles that were picked up. Now, due to the American tank fire from their armor being fired in different directions here and here, they did actually destroy a Chinese ZBDO-4 infantry fighting vehicle with their 120mm L55 main gun, made by Rheinmetall, and they also destroyed a Chi-Com Type 63 armor personnel carrier, and they damaged a few other vehicles where their shots didn't exactly hit the vehicle per se, but hit in front of it and caused some damage due to the blast impact, because 120 millimeter shells are quite potent, especially if they're a heat round or against a vehicle. If it's like a Sabo round or a DU round, they're very potent shells. The Chinese 125 millimeter shells are even stronger and larger, and they can fire ATGMs from their tanks, unlike the rifled barrel and bore types of the bores and rifling barrels that are on the M1A2 tanks. They can't fire ATGMs from their bore, but the Chi-Coms can from their 125 millimeter main tank guns, which also have very long range as well, just over 3 miles. Both the 120 millimeter rifled tank gun and the 125 millimeter guns, they're both extremely long range and very powerful, but the edge goes to the Chinese tanks because they can fire ATGMs, plus they have very strong armor in the case of both the Type 99A especially, but also the Type 96Bs. They have excellent fire control systems. They have laser scrambling and IR scrambling devices. They have combat data links, highly efficient communication systems, fire control systems, laser range finders, gun stabilizing, the whole nine. Everything a modern battle tank should have. These American tanks in this platoon of M1A2s did peel off the back. As these guys rolled forward, these guys peeled off the back, lined up, and began to fire uphill at the Chi-Com tanks. You can see there's woods, mesquite woods mostly, and foliage and scrub woods here, and some hardwood trees. But they're firing uphill where there's steep areas and then not so steep areas of incline as far as the elevation and how suddenly it juts up out of the ground, with the topography. This area is much steeper than this area where it's just a line where they could feasibly just drive down that. But they're firing downhill, which vectoring their weapons, due to it being such a tight circle of only 2 by 2 miles total, they can all vector their weapons downward, which makes it extremely easy for there to not be any friendly fire. So these mechanized infantry forces, of course, also have ZBDO-4As with their anti-tank missile pods on the sides of the turret, 100 millimeter main gun, basically a cannon, and a 30 millimeter autocannon. And they're firing off their HJ-08s from their side pods. They're firing their 100 millimeter cannons, their 30 millimeter autocannons. The gunners on the armor personnel carriers are firing their crew serve weapons. Here you have dismounted infantry to provide infantry support. On the flanks of this grouping, of this company, you have the same over here. As they move up, they're already experiencing contact. There's contact going on between the sides. And there are a few casualties besides just the vehicle crews that were killed by the tank guns of the ZBDO-4 and the ZBDO-4 and the Type 63, who lost their entire infantry squads, which were the crew and the dismounts. And there was a Chinese tank destroyed. One Type 96B was destroyed from American tank fire firing up at them. The rest hit some of the tanks but didn't destroy them, might have damaged some of the armor, and these tanks did have ERA kits put on them, or applique armor kits, which upped their protection even more. And as their armor was already extremely strong, a potent steel tungsten alloy The applique armor kits, or ERA kits, put on the tanks just made them that much more survivable from direct hits from enemy tanks. So the combat here was savage and vicious, and of course the CH-901s being a staple of a lot of the battles, as nearly all headquarters units of all major PLA ground forces elements had dedicated drone sections that operated TEL-based 48-tube systems that could launch 48 CH-901 loitering munitions at a time, and could arm them with several different warhead types, these being armed with heat warheads, as they're going to be used against heavy tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, and MRAPs. So there were a lot of CH-901 kills, as this M1 was destroyed, this M88 was destroyed, this M1 here, right there, was destroyed, and this M1 right there was hit and destroyed by CH-901's loitering munitions. And these tanks up front were viciously hit by artillery and air-dropped munitions, as you see right here, being dropped by the aircraft in this area here. The tank guns from the tank companies belonging to the 1 Tank Battalion of the 17th ID were firing downhill from this side. Tanks from the 1 Battalion committed to the battle of the 165th Armored Division were they who were pursuing in the valley, and also they up on the hill here, as you see a whole tank company is up on this somewhat steeply elevated hill by this ranch up here. And also you can see a few of the anti-tank vehicles, the AFT-10s back here, that belong to the anti-tank company of the 1 battalion of the 165th committed to this fight, as in the 1 armored battalion of the 165th Armored Brigade that was at this battle. These are the headquarters forces belonging to this tank company. And up here you have elements of the headquarters forces following behind these tank platoons, and this whole tank company right here. Parts of this American infantry company here, or rifle company as it was called in this first of the 112th Cav, peeled off in their Bradley and 3 infantry fighting vehicles, M113s, to attempt to put up a fight against the armor, only to be viciously destroyed nearly at point-blank range through this wooded area behind this house here. As you can see, this driveway that runs up through the wooded area and connects to this farm road out here just above the map. There are a lot of country homes and ranches in this valley, as you can see, and a lot of wooded areas and hilly countryside. Initially, they were to take this turn upon reaching the T here on the road. They were to take their right turn, which would be their right, turning here, left if facing this way. But in a panic, just to try to survive, surviving vehicles of the now embattled subunits of the 1st Squadron here of the 112th Cav Regiment were trying to peel off and go anywhere they could, even these headquarters vehicles, which were already taking savage casualties and destruction, already losing the rear 2 MRAPs and an LMTV to tank shells, as well as another LMTV here destroyed by tank shells. This MRAP destroyed by tank shells. This MRAP destroyed by tank shells. And this one taking fire along with this LMTV back here, trying to run the gauntlet of infantry fighting vehicle fire, tank fire, heavy machine gun fire from gun turrets on armored personnel carriers. And these forces here were just trying to survive the huge artillery barrage of these rocket-assisted artillery projectiles, the WS-35Rs, 155mm rocket-assisted satellite-guided projectiles, which made them extremely accurate, right on target. We're talking within inches of a target due to the satellite guidance. The very advanced J-16 fighter jet now returning on yet another sortie to drop ground munitions now that air superiority had already been achieved within the very first hours, and there was no air threat whatsoever at all in this area. So the assigned Air Force elements, the squadron of J-16s in this area of the PLAAF, which was assigned to the specific battle space, could now fly ground attack missions, or ground strike missions, as it's called, in support of the ground troops. And the 1,000-pound munitions made enormous blasts, such as right here, where one had already gone up and taken a few vehicles with it, a few tanks. There were tanks again being fired upon, some being hit and slightly damaged. Only one totally destroyed tank. But some were damaged, as the Americans did try to fight back. But all in all, the Americans were completely destroyed. The whole battalion, or I should say cavalry squadron, was gone. They didn't even reach this bridge by the creek before all of these two, on this side of the H formation of vehicles, these two rifle companies, by the time their surviving vehicles reached here and tried to escape and try to cross the bridge in a last-ditch effort to try to get out of the valley, only to be blocked by armored forces of the one armored battalion belonging to the 17th ID and armored infantry forces of that same armored battalion of the 17th ID, firing everything they had at them, while they tried to desperately return fire only to be completely annihilated. And again, although there were Chinese casualties, they were relatively light, all things considered, because this first of the 112th Cav had some of the heaviest firepower out of the entire 72nd Infantry Brigade combat team, and therefore was a high priority target in terms of elimination and being destroyed, so that all of the flanks near I-35 could be completely clear of any and all enemy resistance. Upon having been completely cut off and completely destroyed, the first of the 112th now ceased to be a factor upon the battlefield. As the battle continued, hour number 5 was coming up insofar as the original timetable was even concerned, as it related to the Chi-Com invasion forces and their external prong of Group Armies 7 through 13, being led by the 10th Group Army, clearing the way and opening the literal and proverbial gateway up the middle of America. Going into hour 5, as the first of the 112th was destroyed within its valley kill box by various types of weapon systems employed against it all at once. The forces of the 165th Armored Brigade and 17th ID prepared to advance to link up with the rest of the 10th Group Army, which was now preparing to advance up I-35, as there was one final sub-battle left in the Battle of Loredo. And that was the battle between the 3rd of the 141st Infantry Regiment and their chain of FOBs relatively adjacent to I-35 and therefore itself another major threat, as well as it being the final force of resistance to tackle within this area, as by now, again, the fighting was on the 5th hour by the time the 165th Armored Brigade and 17th Infantry Division's forces were now clearing the rest of the flanks before preparing to link up with the rest of the Group Army, as they encountered one reactionary group of civilians that tried to charge toward their advance, only to be completely mowed down, with battered few survivors even managing to escape with their lives. But as the Chi-Coms were again on a strict timetable to form up, the very few survivors out of the 200 that attacked were extremely low priority and could be handled by drone or airstrikes or potentially even artillery strikes. So as of now, they were left to their own devices for the time being, as the 17th Infantry Division and 165th Armored Brigade linked up together and prepared to convoy together across fields to link up with the rest of the 10th Group Army, now within Loredo and preparing to encounter and destroy the 3rd of the 141st Infantry Regiment, which itself was a sitting duck at this point and had literally no idea what was in store for it, as it had, again, no communications with the outside world, as all the satellites had been destroyed by anti-sat weapons, both China and Russia predominantly, as well as the cyber attack taking down the military networks, and, of course, the electronic warfare jamming their radios. The commander was indecisive, and as the drones and satellites monitored this unit, attack plans were given to the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division, and if necessary, additional forces of the 10th Group Army as a whole, now having completely made it into the land, about to advance to their ultimate objective, the middle of the country, where they would fan out and assist the Trojan shock armies already deep inside the country capturing their objectives, be they cities, installations, key infrastructure, and more. Battle of Loredo will conclude in the next video.